Well, church, by way of introduction, I would like us to think about sandwiches or samis. Um, I know if you don't have any dietary restrictions, then I'm sure that we've all eaten a sandwich and we do like them. And say, for instance, I would ask you after the service, but what is your favorite sandwich? Then you would probably not tell me that it's something like brown bread and tuna and mayo sandwich. You would also not tell me that it is a white bread and peanut butter and jam sandwich. That just doesn't sound right. Now, you would probably say that you like a tuna and mayo sandwich, or you like a cheese and ham sandwich, or you like a peanut butter and jam sandwich. You see, we talk like that because we know that the inside of the sandwich, the filling of the sandwich, that actually defines the whole sandwich, right? Makes sense? And so, why am I talking about sandwiches? Well, this morning, we are looking at what theologians call a Markan sandwich. Now, a Markan sandwich we find here in our passage that was read for us this morning, Mark chapter 5, verse 21 to 43. That passage takes on the form of a sandwich. You have the two slices and you have the filling on the inside. And the first slice corresponds to our first point, which is a story about a desperate father. From there, it will shift on to the inside or the filling of the bread or sandwich, if you will, and that is the story of a suffering woman. And then it will return to the story of a desperate father. And as with any sandwich, as we have just established, the inside helps us to make sense of the whole. And so that's no different for this Markan sandwich we have in front of us. Well, that's enough about sandwiches for now. Let's get stuck into this passage. Verse 21. And we'll start with the first point, or the first slice, if you will. It's there in your bulletins, a desperate father. Now, verse 21 says, when Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Now, at the start of chapter 5 of Mark, Jesus and his disciples, we are told they got into a boat and they went across the Sea of Galilee or across the Lake of Galilee towards the east. And that territory was a Gentile territory. It was called the region of the Gerasenes. And there Jesus met a demon-possessed man. And this demon-possessed man, God actually, or Jesus, miraculously delivered. So much so that the people within that region, out of fear for Jesus, they said, Jesus, you need to go back from where you came from. And so Jesus and his disciples, they got back into their boats, and again they crossed over the lake to the west side. And there they were met by a large crowd, Mark tells us. And it's in that setting that there was this desperate father that comes to Jesus. Notice in verse 22, it says, then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. Now, just a note on that title, the title of this man named Jairus. We're told that he's one of the synagogue leaders. Now, he would have been one of the leaders within the synagogue or within the local Jewish worshiping community. It sounds like a very fancy title, but his job description was actually not that fancy. He was a layperson within the synagogue. His tasks were mostly those of administration, but because he had a job in the synagogue, he would have been part of the religious establishment of the day who were under the authority of the Pharisees. And this religious establishment, we are told early in the book of Mark, they actually began to plot how to kill Jesus. And now, almost astonishingly, one of their own, this synagogue leader named Jairus, he comes to Jesus and he falls at Jesus' feet. But what for? Well, verse 23 tells us. Notice it says, he pleaded earnestly with him. This is now with Jesus. "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." And these are the words of a desperate father, because his daughter is literally going to die unless Jesus comes. Now, perhaps more astonishingly is what Jesus does next. Because Jesus knowing that Jairus is a synagogue leader, knowing that he's part of a religious or the religious establishment of the day, and knowing that they want to plan or they are planning to kill him, Jesus, knowing all of this, he doesn't turn down or decline the plea of this desperate person. No, he actually accepts it. That's what verse 24 tells us. It says, "So Jesus went with him." And notice it wasn't only Jesus going with him. No, there was this crowd also going. They were pressing around him. They were pressing around Jesus as they were making their way to Jairus' house. Now remember, time is of the essence, right? They needed to get to Jairus' house because there was a daughter that was in need of Jesus. Now we aren't told how far they had to travel, but we know that they had to get there. But this crowd didn't seem to make things easy, because Mark says that they were pressing around Jesus. It seems as if this crowd was slowing things down. And I think we here in the northern suburbs or wherever in Cape Town or South Africa, we know how that looks like when people slow things down, especially when there's an accident on the N1 or an accident on the road, and people slow down deliberately, not out of caution, but just to have a peek at what is happening. They slow down the traffic, and it seems as if these people, this crowd, was trying to slow down this, the fact that Jesus needed to get to this man's house. Everything was slowing down. And Mark tells us that in that moment, a woman came to Jesus. Remember that sandwich that we spoke about earlier? The slice and then the filling? Well, here's the filling of this passage. And it comes in the form of this suffering woman, this filling. Notice how Mark describes this woman there in verses 25 and 26. He says that she was suffering. He said that she had some form of condition that left her bleeding for 12 years. So went to all kinds of doctors, Mark tells us, and she also spent all of her money on getting better. But Mark says that instead of getting better, she actually got worse. And what's perhaps worse than that is the fact that under Old Testament law, because of her bleeding, she would have been considered unclean. And not only that, whoever comes in contact with her would also be considered unclean. And whoever was unclean, they were removed from the community until they were considered clean again. I mean, we can just imagine the situation of this woman. She's hit rock bottom. It seems like a hopeless situation for her. But then Mark tells us that she somehow heard about Jesus. Verse 27 and 28 says, and I'll just summarize it, she heard, she came, and she touched. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Now, we are told in the book of Exodus in chapter 29 that when Aaron and his sons were consecrated as priests, as part of their consecration, the altar of God also had to be consecrated. And in verse 37 of Exodus 29, it says that whoever touches the holy altar in turn would be made holy. Now, maybe this woman saw Jesus this way, as some form of representative from God. And if she just touches his clothes, like touching the altar, she would be made holy or be made clean. Mark says that she heard about Jesus. Maybe she heard about all the things Jesus did. The healing of a demon-possessed man in the account just prior to this passage of ours. Or maybe she heard about the story before that of how Jesus showed his authority over creation. When Jesus got into that little boat, you would remember, he stood up and he said, or he rebuked the winds and he rebuked the waves, saying, "Quiet, be still." And so whether she heard about Jesus' authority over demons or Jesus' authority over creation, whatever she heard, it was enough for her to believe that Jesus was able to save her. That is what that word healed in verse 28 actually means. In the Greek, it is sozo, and it means to save, not just physically, but also spiritually. This woman, she heard, she came, and she touched. And then what happened? Well, verse 29 says that immediately, one of Mark's favorite words, immediately her bleeding stopped and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. How amazing is that? And notice that Mark says that Jesus noticed that someone had touched him. Or rather, verse 30 says, at once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" In a massive crowd pressing against Jesus, Jesus asked, "Who touched my clothes?" Now just imagine we didn't have the commentary of Mark here. The commentary of who touched Jesus. Imagine we didn't know that it was this unnamed woman who touched Jesus. If that was the case, then in a crowd like this, pressing against Jesus, surely it could have been anyone, right? And that seems to be what the disciples were thinking and saying as well. Verse 31 says, "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Jesus was basically looking around to see who had touched him by faith. Now, at this moment, perhaps Jairus was standing there to the side, very politely, very piously, thinking to himself, but sure, we need to get to my daughter. The crowd is already delaying Jesus, and now it seems as if Jesus is deliberately delaying everything as well. And I think that might be what we are also thinking. Thinking about why would Jesus stop for someone who has already been healed from a chronic condition as opposed to an acute condition, to raise someone from the dead, as we will see later on. In the medical world, this would have been considered as malpractice back then and today. You don't go for the chronic condition, you go for the acute condition first. And it seems as if Jesus was lingering on the chronic condition. Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Who touched me? Where are you? Well, it's interesting that there's another place in the Bible where something similar to this story actually happens. Where an individual is looked for and is asked, "Where are you?" It's the Garden of Eden, right? Where God calls for Adam, and really it seems as if ever since the time of the Garden of Eden, people have tried to hide from God. They've tried to hide their guilt from God. They tried to hide their shame from God. And it seems as if this woman in our passage may have wanted to do the same thing, to hide her shame in particular, not only from Jesus, but obviously from this huge crowd that was with Jesus as well. And that is what shame does. Guilt, you may know, is something that you know that you have done something wrong. It's something that only you know of. But shame is other people also knowing that there's something wrong in your life. And so Jesus, looking for this woman, was it to increase her shame? Because verse 33 says, "Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth." She told him everything. And this in the presence of this great crowd pressing around her. Yeah, I mean, you can almost hear the gasps. You can hear the whispering. Did Jesus do this just to add to her shame? Calling her out like this? Does Jesus call people to him just to show themselves and show others how broken they are, how messed up they are? Well, the answer is no. Now, Jesus didn't want to add to her shame. Instead, he wanted to lift her shame. Notice Jesus' words in verse 34. It says, daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering. And what beautiful words. Because with those words of Jesus, Jesus publicly vindicates this woman. The whispering turns into silence. The gasps turn into wonder. Wonder that Jesus would call this woman his daughter. That Jesus would tell this woman that she belongs to him. In a moment, in one moment, 12 years of shame, 12 years of pain and ostracization and guilt and all of those things, shame, it's all been lifted for this woman in one moment. And not because of how strong her faith was, but because of how strong the one in whom she had put her faith in to do this, in Jesus. She heard, she came, and she touched. Now, all of this is happening while Jairus, this desperate father, he's standing there, maybe waiting for Jesus to get done. But before Jesus could even finish his words to this woman, Mark tells us that there came news from Jairus' house, and it wasn't good news. Verse 35 tells us, while Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. Your daughter is dead, they say. Why bother the teacher anymore? I mean, no parent would ever want to hear that they will outlive their child. And perhaps Jairus felt like Martha when her brother Lazarus in John chapter 11 had died. Martha said, Jesus, if you had only been here, Jesus, then my brother would not have died. If only you hadn't delayed, Jesus, then you could have saved my daughter, Jairus may have thought. I mean, and in that moment, a moment that must have been heart-wrenching, excruciating, filled with pain and filled with confusion, in that moment comes the tender yet powerful words of Jesus. Verse 36 says, overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, don't be afraid, just believe. I think for us readers, we should sort of start to at least see now why Jesus actually allowed this interruption of this suffering woman. Why he stopped to give attention to her. It's because he wanted Jairus to see that the faith he needs in this very terrible moment that he's experiencing, he wanted Jairus to see that the faith he needs is the faith of this suffering woman. That faith which is a faith not in oneself. It's a faith not in faith, but it's a faith in Jesus. Because it's not how strong or how weak our faith is. It's all about how strong the object of our faith is. And Jesus has already shown how powerful and how strong he is. Well, Jesus continues to make his way to the synagogue leader's house. And notice he doesn't make a big thing about it. He doesn't put on billboards or on social media, listen, I'm going to Jairus' house, miracle service happening, you have to be there. No, in fact, he does the opposite. He disperses this whole crowd that was following him until now. Verse 37 says, he did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, John, and the brother of Jesus. And when he got to Jairus' house, he even got rid of all these professional mourners. These were hired people at a funeral for the purpose of crying. And we see them there in verse 38. It says, when they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing. Now, we are told that there were literally people in the first century who were paid to mourn and cry at someone's funeral. We're told that back then, every person in Israel had to at least have, even the poorest of the poor, they need to at least have 2 flute players and 1 wailing woman, or crying woman. It was usually women, it seems. And what they would do were to accompany the coffin from the house all the way to the gravesite. And as they were doing that, they were clapping their hands and they were crying loudly. Not necessarily because they were genuinely sad about what had happened. It's just that was their job, to cry at someone's death. And so when Jesus went into Jairus' home, he said in verse 39, why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep. Well, to this statement, they laughed at Jesus, the next verse tells us. Now, many people today, it seems both Bible scholars and lay people, they believe that this girl was never really dead to start with. They say that she was simply in some sort of coma, that she was in some sort of state of unconsciousness. And that is why Jesus says that she's asleep. And therefore they say Jesus didn't raise her from the dead. No, he simply sort of resuscitated her. He revived her. He brought her back to a state of consciousness from a state of unconsciousness. She only appeared to be dead, they say. That is what they say. But I don't think that's what the Bible is saying. Why? Well, I think there's 3 reasons. I'll just give them briefly. One of them is because these mourners that I've talked about, mourners and the commotion that was happening, they wouldn't have been there if this girl was not really dead. Remember, that's their job, to mourn and to make a commotion when someone has died. I think the second thing is that Mark, Matthew, Luke, all of them actually say that this girl was dead. So that's not 1 eyewitness account, that's 3 eyewitness accounts that actually attest to the fact that this girl was really dead. And then I think lastly, Jesus, he uses the same language of being asleep to describe Lazarus' state of deadness in John's gospel. And so I think given all those reasons, I believe that this girl was dead. However, what do we do with Jesus' words about her being asleep? Well, in the story of Lazarus' death, there as well as here, Jesus speaks of death as something not final. He says that it's not the end, it's not the final chapter. But when we are speaking about death, we know that generally people are terrified about death because they do think it is the end. We've read earlier in Psalm 55 of how the psalmist said, my heart is in anguish within me. The terrors of death have fallen upon me. And the terror of death not only fell on the psalmist, but also it falls on all people throughout the Bible. We actually see this in the time of the Exodus as well, where God brought a display of his power on the people of Egypt through the plagues. Many people died because of Pharaoh's hard-heartedness toward God. And those who were still alive, they begged the people of God to leave. Why? Because they feared their own death. In the time of the prophet Samuel, when the Philistines captured the ark of God, and God afflicted the Philistines with tumors, so much so that the Philistines cried out and they said, take this ark back to the place where it came from, or it will kill us and it will kill our people. Why? Because death had filled the city with fear. There's a fear that death is final. No wonder some tech gurus I've seen the other day, they're actually trying to come up with a way to be immortal, to not die, to escape death altogether. And to be fair, the Bible does say that death is our final opponent. But the Bible also says that death has been conquered. And in this passage of this morning, this desperate father, he sees death conquered. And he sees his daughter brought back to life by Jesus by simply saying a few words. Have a look at verse 41. Jesus took her by the hand and said to her, Talitha cum. Now these were Aramaic words that Jesus spoke, but they shouldn't be seen as magic words. So Jesus saying Talitha cum is not the equivalent of someone saying abracadabra. Now Mark actually gives us a translation. He says Talitha cum means, little girl, I say to you, get up. Now back then, Talitha cum would have been a very ordinary way, a very ordinary thing to say to get your child up in the morning. At our home, we would open the blinds in our kids' bedroom and we would say, good morning, or goeiemorgen, because the little one needs to start learning Afrikaans for assessments at school, and we would probably say that a couple of times before they get up. But that which you would say to a child, a parent, an ordinary thing, a loving thing, that is what Mark is getting at here, what Jesus was doing to this girl. I hope we can see that Jesus takes something ordinary, waking up a child, to accomplish something extraordinary, raising someone from the dead. Dear friends, Mark is showing us that for Jesus, conquering death is as easy as waking up a child from his sleep. Verse 42 says, immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. They were astonished because a miracle had taken place in front of their very eyes. They've now firsthand seen Jesus' power both in healing and saving the suffering woman, and now they see Jesus' power in raising this little girl from the dead. But not only did they see his power, they also saw his compassion. His compassion in listening to the plea of a desperate father, pleading for his dying daughter. They've seen now his compassion for a woman having suffered with a medical condition for 12 years and covered in shame. They've seen now Jesus' compassion for how he cares for a father and a mother who have lost their child. And they've also now seen Jesus' compassion in how he says in verse 43, give the child something to eat. They've seen compassion, they've seen power, they've seen miracles. No wonder Jesus tells them, listen here, don't go and tell anyone, not just yet. Because if they would and people would probably find out, immediately they would come flocking to the house to see this miracle and to also see Jesus, the miracle worker. But Jesus is more than that. Jesus' true identity is that of the Son of God. And for anyone to truly see who Jesus is, the cross had to happen. Because remember, later on, if you have read through Mark, I'm sure you have, later on in the book of Mark in chapter 15, it was at the cross, at the foot of the cross, where there was this Roman centurion seeing Jesus dying, hearing and seeing Jesus breathing out his last breath. It was there on the cross that he said, but truly, this is the Son of God. And the Bible tells us that whoever believes in the Son of God shall never die. Because he was raised from the dead and he lives, and because he lives, all who believe in him shall also live. That's the story. What a beautiful story, remarkable story. A story about the power and the compassion of Jesus. Well, what are some things that we can take home for ourselves from this passage? And I'll just mention two of them briefly. And the first thing that I would like to draw attention to is, again, just to remember the suffering woman. Remember, before coming to Jesus, she was covered in shame. And no doubt she was also experiencing a lot of pain. She was suffering. And Mark seems to be showing to us that it's exactly her shame, it's her suffering, it's her shame and her pain. All of those things led her to Jesus. Which makes me to wonder if our pain and if our shame and if our suffering is perhaps not a God-ordained means of drawing us to Jesus, to either confess some form of sin or to receive encouragement from him for the way forward. And so for that reason, dear Christian, it might be that your suffering, it might be that your pain is a God-ordained means of drawing you nearer to your Savior, Jesus Christ. And perhaps it's even more so a God-ordained means of drawing someone to Jesus who do not belong to Jesus yet. Perhaps like the suffering women in our passage, you may feel that you have been covered with shame, that you are filled with guilt over something. Perhaps you may feel like too bad of a sinner and that you will never be able to belong to Jesus or to his family. Well, that's not true, dear friend, because Jesus says this morning, come. There's room for you. He wants to call you daughter. He wants to call you son. He wants you to belong to him. That is why Mark says throughout his gospel, this is what Jesus came to do, to bring good news. The good news of how sinners like you and me can be reconciled to a holy God. Do you belong to Jesus, dear friend? And then just lastly, remember we saw that delay of Jesus, that almost divine delay. Well, I believe this story of Mark is recorded here precisely for people like you and me. People who are perhaps not living in the sight of miracles like we have seen in this passage of this morning. People like you and me who have not seen a loved one brought back to life. I think we are experiencing the divine delay of Jesus just like Jairus was. But only until Jesus' second coming. When on that day, not only one suffering woman will be healed, and not only one young girl will be raised to new life, but all will be healed and all will be raised to life, all who have put their faith and trust in Jesus. That's the promise. That's the hope held out for us. Don't be afraid, Jesus says. Just trust me. Let's pray.